All right, so today we're doing the menstrual cycle. It's kind of split into two main things that happen within each cycle, and we know the cycle is 28 days on average, right? But the changes actually occur on two different levels, and it might help to think about it in terms of two different processes going on at once, right? One in the ovaries and one within the endometrium, so within the uterus, right? And just broadly speaking, the ovaries are split into two phases, right? The ovarian cycle, we have the follicular phase, which is kind of like the first half, and luteal phase, which over here is the second half. Okay, and on average, we said that it's 28 days in total, and nicely conveniently, it's split into two. So day 14 normally marks the transition between the follicular and the luteal phase. One thing to just note though is that with the division of the two parts, the second phase, the luteal phase, is usually always 14 days. The bit that is variable is the follicular phase, the first phase, right? Some people have it like ovulation occurring on day 10, day 15, day 20, depending on like pathology or even just normal variation, right? So we're saying the luteal is kind of constant and the follicular phase is what varies. All right, so we define day one of the follicular phase by the first day of menstrual bleeding, right? So the first day that the lady gets their period, right, they start shedding blood, is, we say, kind of day 0 of the cycle, okay? And what happens is it's all driven by hormones. So if you see here that we're starting with a slightly elevated FSH level, follicle stimulating hormone, right? And where this came from is the corpus luteum of the previous cycle. So essentially, as the corpus luteum was degrading in the previous cycle, it's producing less progesterone, estrogen, and inhibins. And by the action of negative feedback, this is going to cause an increase in FSH levels, right? And this is kind of the trigger for stage 1 of the menstrual cycle, okay? So as FSH is high and elevated, right? It's kind of in the name, follicle stimulating hormone. So what does it do? It drives follicular genesis. And this is the process by which not only follicles grow, but also the way we select which follicle is going to be ovulated during the cycle, right? So there's kind of unofficial terminology that's used, is like recruitment, selection, and then formation of your Graafian follicle, okay? So with recruitment, it takes, FSH causes the growth of approximately 10 to 30 follicles, okay? And one is then selected to be what is called the dominant follicle. There's kind of debate as to what determines which is the dominant follicle. However, within the literature, there is some sort of agreement that it may be to do with how many FSH receptors there are, which should hopefully make sense, because the more FSH receptors you have, the more it's going to grow, and that's going to become the dominant one, right? The other up to 29 follicles undergo what's called atresia, and it's the process by which they kind of like atrophy and degrade. All right, so once you've like recruited your 10 to 30 follicles, you've selected which one you're going to pick for ovulation, that one then grows the largest and turns into what is called a Graafian follicle, okay? So, as this follicle grows, right, within the granulosa cells, we know that FSH stimulates the action of aromatase, right? So we're going to have increased estrogen production, right? More specifically, we say it's estradiol, okay? And this estrogen, as it increases in levels due to this growth of a follicle, of the Graafian follicle, it acts in a positive feedback manner, right? And what it does is it feeds back onto the anterior pituitary to cause a spike in luteinizing hormone. Okay. Now that spike in luteinizing hormone, right, this pre-ovulatory surge, as it's called, is what drives the Graafian follicle to swell, and like it swells up and then it ruptures. And as it ruptures, it releases that oocyte. That oocyte is then going to be the egg that may be fertilized during that menstrual cycle. All right, just a quick detail to add. Noting that we said FSH starts high, which is driving that follicular growth to cause estrogen production, just noting that it goes back down. And we say by the mid-follicular phase, which is it's kind of poorly defined, but we say at the mid-follicular phase, or even as far as day 10, FSH reaches its lowest point, yeah? Because that negative feedback, as estrogen is going up, it's going to feed back again onto the anterior pituitary to have negative feedback on FSH. All right, so now that we've reached our peak of luteinizing hormone at day 14, we said ovulation occurs, and that's kind of the transition into the luteal phase. But before we look into the luteal phase, I'm just going to quickly look at what happens at the level of the uterus, right? Within that follicular phase of the ovaries, we have two phases going on within the endometrium, right? The menstrual phase and the proliferative phase. So the menstrual phase is approximately 5 days, and it's when we have shedding of the menstrual lining, right? When a woman undergoes bleeding. And so what happens is, if you know some histology of the uterus, we have the 3 layers, right? The stratum compacta, spongosa, basalis. So when we have that shedding of the menstrual layer of the endometrium, we retain the stratum basalis, but we shed off the spongosa and compacta. Okay. And if you can kind of see, right, at day 5, once that menstrual cycle is finished, and is kind of when estrogen is going up. And estrogen has a proliferative role, right? That's why we say that when estrogen is going up, we actually see the endometrial lining also growing in thickness, yeah? Estrogen is the driver of endometrial proliferation. And just as a quick aside, this is kind of clinically relevant because if you have, right, high estrogen levels, right, you're going to cause endometrial proliferation, and that in itself can cause hyperplasia, disposition to acquisition of mutations, and can cause an endometrioid adenocarcinoma. Yeah. All right, now onto the luteal phase. So we said that luteinizing hormone was at its highest point, right? And that's when ovulation occurred. We say by about day 16, right? So approximately here, that positive feedback mechanism where estrogen acts to increase luteinizing hormone, which is kind of counterintuitive for any endocrine feedback loop, right? That positive feedback declines, is kind of lost after 2 days, and it returns to that default setting of negative feedback, right? So once ovulation has occurred and you've released that oocyte, the follicle becomes what's called the corpus luteum. And that corpus luteum secretes 3 main hormones, which is kind of what triggered the start of the cycle in the first place. We got progesterone, estrogen, and inhibin. Progesterone is the main driver, okay? And sorry we've only got progesterone on this diagram. If you wanted to see estrogen, it would also increase, but it only comes up to here. Progesterone is the main driver, however, it's just important to note these both are also involved, okay? So if you increase these hormones, right, we said that we've reverted back to negative feedback. So hopefully it makes sense that your luteinizing hormone, your FSH are gonna go down, right? They're kind of inversely related. So as progesterone and estrogen are going up, the stimulators are going down. All right, and just an interesting point, right? If we say that progesterone here is at its highest at approximately day 21, day 22, if you want to check if ovulation has occurred, one of the things you do is like a day 21, day 22 progesterone check. And if that's really high, you know that at this point ovulation has occurred, you form the corpus luteum, which is driving that increase in progesterone. Because noticing beforehand, we had no driver of progesterone. The only thing that's triggering it is the corpus luteum. And the only way we can form a corpus luteum is if we had ovulation at this point, yeah? So that's actually a really good marker of whether ovulation occurred in the first place. All right, so we said that our progesterone is going up, we've gone into day 21, our LH and FSH have gone down. But this kind of has an effect. So if we have no LH or FSH, right, then we have no more stimulation of the corpus luteum. Nothing is driving it to keep going, right? Nothing is causing it to stay stimulated, to remain alive. So the effect of that, right, is it then has a decrease in its ability to produce the hormones, right? It got to that peak because it was really strong, it was strongly secreting and producing the hormones. But then because of no stimulation, it decreases its ability. That corpus luteum starts to degrade, right? And that degradation, right, causes a fall in the reproductive hormones, an increase in the releasing hormones, right, the stimulating hormones, which actually starts us back to the beginning, because it's that end increase in the anterior pituitary hormones that drove right? That follicular phase, okay? So progesterone goes down, you can no longer maintain your endometrial lining, you get bleeding, your stimulating hormones go up, you start your next cycle. All right, just to finish off, what happens in this phase, right? During the luteal phase, what happens within the endometrium, right? We call this the secretory phase. So what happens is, we've built up our endometrium predominantly due to estrogen, right? It's still kind of growing, it reaches a peak, but because our progesterone is the main hormone involved, it's no longer in a proliferative state, it's more in a secretory state. What this means is we have growth of what's called the spiral arteries, right? The endometrium becomes increasingly vascular because it's preparing, like what happens if I have implantation? This baby's going to need like a blood supply, I need to be able to form a placenta. So it gets ready, it becomes increasingly vascular. And not only is it ready for a baby, right? It increases its glands, right? It becomes increasingly glandular. And this causes secretion of uterine milk, which nourishes a developing blastocyst. And if you're increasing your ability to make secretions, you also need increased blood supply because you have increased energy expenditure. So the spiral arteries then have a twofold function. Yeah, so that's kind of the menstrual cycle in a nutshell. I guess takeaways, think of it in kind of two processes, and what's actually happening can kind of be derived from a knowledge of the function of the hormones in the first place.